Chapter 1, The Perfect Family. David Evans was a man who believed in the ideals of loyalty, love, and family. A hard-working man, he had spent the better part of his life creating a stable, perfect world for his wife, Sophia, and their two children, Ellie and Jake. He had always imagined that his family would be the one thing in his life that would remain constant, no matter what challenges life threw at him. David and Sophia had known each other since high school. Their love story was one that most people envied. They were high school sweethearts, married young, and had built a life together with love and commitment. They were in their 30s now, living in a beautiful house in the suburbs, with a well-manicured lawn, a dog named Buddy, and two children who loved them deeply. David worked as a financial consultant, a job that allowed them a comfortable life. Sophia stayed at home, taking care of the children and managing the house, although she sometimes worked part-time as a graphic designer from home. David was proud of what they had built. But as the years went by, something began to shift, something subtle that he couldn't quite put his finger on. Sophia had always been the vibrant, energetic woman he had fallen in love with. But lately, she seemed different, distant, distracted, and less affectionate. At first, David dismissed it. After all, life was busy. They had two kids, work, and all the responsibilities that came with being a family. But deep down, David knew something had changed. He started noticing small things. Sophia's phone, which she always kept on the kitchen counter, was now always in her purse, and when he asked her about it, she would get defensive, telling him it was nothing. She stopped cooking their dinners together, something they'd always done as a family. Their nights, once filled with laughter and conversation, now felt cold and empty. But nothing prepared David for the day he would find out the truth, the day everything he had built would come crashing down. Chapter 2, The Uneasy Feeling. David's suspicion grew over the course of several months. Sophia was always busy with her work, but she seemed more and more distant. He was often away from home during the week, but when he came back, the house felt different. The atmosphere was tense, filled with unspoken words. He began to ask her about it, but Sophia would always deflect, telling him everything was fine. She'd smile and brush it off, but David could see the hesitation in her eyes. It wasn't just her behavior. David began to notice something odd about the way she interacted with their close friends. Mark, one of David's best friends from college, had been a regular guest at their home for years. He was someone David trusted deeply, someone who had been there for him during difficult times. David could sense that Mark was acting strangely around Sophia lately, though. He would glance at her in a way that made David uncomfortable. Mark, too, seemed distracted and avoided eye contact when speaking to David. At first, David didn't want to entertain such thoughts. Mark was his friend, and Sophia was his wife. Surely, nothing was amiss. But one evening, as David was finishing work late and heading home, he felt a strange pull to call Sophia. He had been feeling the weight of the growing distance between them and wanted to address it once and for all. He dialed her number and listened as it rang, but there was no answer. Confused, he tried again. Still, no answer. Then, something caught his eye as he drove past a street corner near their home, a car parked in front of a quiet cafe, the one where Mark had always liked to meet up for a drink after work. David wasn't sure why, but a feeling of unease washed over him. His heart rate quickened as he pulled into the parking lot, his mind racing. Through the cafe window, he saw them. Sophia and Mark were sitting together at a small table, laughing. Mark leaned forward, his hand resting on Sophia's. She looked up at him, her face flushed, her eyes sparkling with something David hadn't seen in years. It was a look of affection, a kind of intimacy that should have been reserved for her husband, not her best friend. The sight cut through David like a knife, and suddenly, everything became clear. His worst fear had come true. His wife, the woman he had loved and trusted, was betraying him. Chapter 3, The Confrontation. David's heart was pounding in his chest as he stood frozen in the doorway of the cafe. His hands trembled as he watched them, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He couldn't breathe. The images before him seemed surreal, like something out of a nightmare. His best friend and his wife, sitting there so comfortably, so intimately, as if nothing was wrong. He could feel the heat rising in his face, a mixture of anger, hurt and disbelief. Sophia and Mark finally noticed him standing there, and their faces immediately fell. Mark quickly pulled his hand away from Sophia's, and they both stood up awkwardly. David didn't know what to say, but the words came out anyway. How long? David's voice was shaky but filled with rage. How long has this been going on? Sophia opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Mark stepped forward, looking guilty, but David wasn't interested in hearing his friend's excuses. David, Mark started, this isn't what you think. No, David interrupted, his voice rising. This is exactly what I think. He turned to Sophia, his eyes filled with pain. You've been lying to me all this time, haven't you? All the late nights, all the secrecy, the way you've pulled away from me. I thought I was crazy, but I wasn't. You've been having an affair with him. Sophia's face turned pale, and she collapsed back into the chair. She shook her head, but her eyes were filled with tears. David, please. I never meant for this to happen. I'm so sorry. Sorry. David repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. Sorry doesn't fix this, Sophia. You've destroyed everything we had. Everything. Sophia tried to reach out to him, but David backed away, unable to bear her touch. Mark, seeing the intensity of the moment, stepped back, unsure of what to do. The tension in the room was suffocating. David could hardly hear his own thoughts over the pounding in his head. You've ruined us, David whispered. I don't know who you are anymore. He turned and walked out of the cafe, his heart heavy with the weight of the betrayal. As he walked to his car, his mind raced with thoughts of revenge, anger, and devastation. Everything he thought he knew about his life had been shattered in that moment. He didn't know how to fix it. He didn't know if it could be fixed. Chapter 4, The Breaking Point. That night, David went home to an empty house. His children were at their grandmother's house, a planned visit that had been arranged weeks ago. He stood in the living room, staring at the empty space, the silence pressing down on him. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison. Sophia's belongings were everywhere, her perfume on the dresser, her favorite books scattered around the house, the photos of their children on the mantel. He felt suffocated by her presence even though she wasn't there. David was consumed with anger, but also with a deep sense of loss. He couldn't understand how Sophia, the woman he had trusted with his heart, could do this to him. She had been everything to him, the love of his life, his partner. And now, she had betrayed him in the worst way possible. Unable to contain his emotions any longer, David reached for the whiskey bottle on the kitchen counter. He poured himself a drink, then another, and then another. The alcohol burned as it slid down his throat, but it didn't numb the pain. Nothing could. Hours passed, and David became increasingly intoxicated. His mind kept returning to the image of Sophia and Mark together, to the way she had looked at him in that cafe. He could still hear her voice, begging him to forgive her, but his anger was too great. He couldn't let go of the hurt, the humiliation, and the rage that were now consuming him. Suddenly, he heard a car pull into the driveway. His heart skipped a beat. Sophia was back. She had come to explain herself, to beg for forgiveness. But David couldn't listen. He didn't want to hear her excuses anymore. When she walked into the house, her face pale and her eyes red from crying, he looked at her with a coldness she had never seen before. I don't want to hear it, David said, his voice flat and emotionless. I don't want to hear your excuses. You've already said enough. Sophia took a step forward, her hands trembling. David, please. But David wasn't listening anymore. He couldn't. His mind was a blur, and in that moment, everything, the anger, the pain, the betrayal, reached its breaking point. Without thinking, without fully understanding what he was doing, he picked up the gun from the drawer, a gun he had kept for years but never thought he'd use. Sophia froze, her face a mix of fear and confusion. "David, no," she whispered. But it was too late. The gunshot rang out in the silence of the house, deafening in its finality. David stared at Sophia's lifeless body in shock, his hands trembling as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. Chapter 5: The Consequences. The following days were a blur for David. He had turned himself into the police, but nothing could erase what had happened. Sophia was gone. And so was everything else he had known. David was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of his wife. The pain of losing her, and the guilt of killing her, would haunt him for the rest of his days. He would never escape the consequences of his actions. David's story serves as a tragic reminder of how deep betrayal and heartbreak can push a person. How a moment of rage and pain can irreversibly change a life. Tell us your opinion in the comments, we will be happy to hear from you.